The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and the air carried that heavy scent of wet wood and memory. Emma Cole stood in the middle of her late father's lake house, staring at the open attic hatch. It was the first time she'd been back in years, not since David disappeared. The silence here was the same as it had been the morning he left, a silence that never explained anything. She pulled down the old wooden ladder, its joints creaking, and climbed up. Dust floated in the dim light, swirling like tiny ghosts. Boxes lined the far wall, some marked as Maz, others books, and one, pushed deep into the corner, with her name written in David's unmistakable handwriting, Emma. Her breath caught. For a second, she thought it was a trick of the light. He'd been gone 5 years, declared legally dead too. But his handwriting, the way he looped the double M, she would have recognized it anywhere. Emma hesitated before dragging the box into the center of the attic. The cardboard was soft, damp in places. A faint scent of cedar and something else, something metallic, like old coins, seeped through. She sat cross-legged and opened it. Inside lay a few photos, an old wristwatch she'd bought him on their second anniversary, a lighter with the initials DC engraved, and a worn leather journal tied with a frayed string. On the cover, written in faint pencil, "Don't open if it still hurts." Her throat tightened. The rain outside intensified, tapping against the roof in an uneven rhythm, like an anxious heartbeat. For a long time, she just stared at the journal. 5 years of anger, confusion, and blame sat inside her chest like a stone. But curiosity, or maybe longing, won. She untied the string and opened the first page. June 2nd. If you're reading this, M, I guess I failed to disappear the way I planned. You always said truth should never be buried. I'm trying to believe that now. Emma's hands trembled. His handwriting was rushed, uneven, as if written in fear or urgency. The words blurred as her eyes filled. She turned the page. I left because I didn't know who I was with you anymore. I loved you, but somewhere along the way, I started performing love instead of living it. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every promise felt like a lie I was telling to keep us from falling apart. You didn't see it, and maybe I didn't want you to. Emma pressed her lips together, fighting the swell of emotion. She wanted to scream at the page, to ask why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you stay? But the answers were already written there, in his exhaustion, in the way every line felt like a confession whispered to no one. I thought leaving would free us both. But the truth is, it broke me. I keep dreaming about the lake, the way you'd watch the water without speaking. I think that's when I loved you most, when you were quiet, when you didn't need me to be anything but there. A tear hit the page, spreading the ink. Emma closed the journal abruptly, as if afraid she'd drown in it. She took a shaky breath, stood, and looked out the attic window. The lake shimmered through the rain, gray and endless. It was where they'd first met. She'd been 25, stubborn and wild. He 30, charming and full of plans. They'd promised forever. But forever had lasted 7 years. And then one morning, his truck was gone, his phone left on the kitchen table beside a half-empty cup of coffee. A note, "Don't look for me." The police had searched for months. No trace. No body. Eventually, everyone moved on. Everyone but her. Now, holding the journal, Emma realized he hadn't vanished without a word. He'd just waited until she was ready to listen. She turned on the small reading lamp near the window and sat again, opening to the next entry. June 5th. The lie wasn't one moment. It was small things. I said I was happy when I wasn't. I said I forgave you when I didn't. I let resentment build until it became a second skin. You tried. I know you did. But love shouldn't feel like debt, and we started keeping score a long time ago. Emma exhaled sharply, her chest aching. She remembered the fights, over money, over his job, over the fact that she wanted kids, and he didn't. They'd apologized 100 times, made up, promised to change. But maybe he'd already been halfway gone even then. She flipped through more pages. The handwriting shifted, Messier, darker. July 10th. There's a cabin north of here, near the border. Sometimes I think about coming back, but I wouldn't know what to say. I'm learning to breathe again, but guilt follows me like a shadow. If I ever send this back to you, I hope it's because you've found peace, or because I finally have. The sound of thunder rolled through the sky, low and distant. Emma shut the journal, her hands clutching it like something fragile. She stood, moved to the window, and whispered, "You were alive." The words hung in the still air. Somewhere beyond the rain and the mist, maybe he still was. She looked down at the box again. Beneath the journal, something else caught her eye. A small folded map, edges worn, one corner marked in red ink. Cabin, don't forget the key. Her pulse quickened. She knew that area. It was only 2 hours north. For the first time in years, a strange feeling pulsed through her. Not just grief, but purpose. Maybe this wasn't an ending after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something she wasn't ready to admit she still wanted. Closure. Or forgiveness. Or him. The drive north felt longer than it should have. The rain had slowed but left behind a sky the color of steel, and the highway shimmered under a thin veil of fog. Emma's hands stayed tight on the steering wheel, as if letting go would send her spinning into the past she was chasing. The map sat on the passenger seat beside her, the red mark glaring like a wound. She had told no one she was going. Not her sister, not her best friend, not even her lawyer who'd helped finalize David's death certificate 2 years ago. This wasn't a journey for explanations. This was between her and the man who'd vanished. By the time she turned off the main road, dusk was closing in. The old forest road was narrow, gravel snapping under her tires, branches brushing the roof like fingers. She caught glimpses of the lake through the trees, darker now, almost black, its surface rippling with the last of the evening wind. Her heart drummed in her throat. If the cabin really existed, she'd know soon enough. 10 minutes later, she saw it. A small structure tucked deep among the pines, roof sagging, windows fogged from the inside. The front porch light flickered, a soft, dying yellow. Her breath hitched. Someone had been here recently. She parked and stepped out, boots sinking into the wet ground. Every instinct screamed caution, but curiosity pulled her forward like a tether. She climbed the porch steps, her pulse loud in her ears, and turned the old brass doorknob. It clicked open easily. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, smoke, and something faintly familiar, sandalwood, David's cologne. The room was simple, a wood stove in the corner, a single bed, shelves lined with canned food and books. On the small table by the window sat a coffee mug, half full, still warm. Emma's stomach dropped. "Hello." Her voice cracked the silence. No answer. She took another step inside, scanning the room. A jacket hung on the chair. She recognized it instantly, brown leather with a tear on the sleeve. Her eyes darted toward the fireplace. Above it, taped to the wooden mantel, was a photo of them. The two of them laughing by the lake, years ago. Her breath came out sharp. This wasn't an abandoned place. Someone, had lived here. Maybe still did. The journal was still in her bag. She took it out and laid it on the table. It looked at home here, as if it had found its way back. She sat in the chair, heart pounding, and opened to where she'd left off. August 3rd. I came back today. I watched from the hill, saw the house lights on. You're still there, still waiting. I almost walked down the path, almost knocked. But I couldn't. Not yet. You deserve the truth, but I'm not ready to tell it. Emma swallowed hard. Her fingers brushed the edge of the page, feeling the indentation of his pen strokes. August 10th. I met someone near the border, a man who knew things about my father, things I thought were buried with him. Turns out the lies didn't start with me. They started long before us, Em. Maybe that's why I couldn't stay. I was too much like him. She frowned. David had rarely talked about his father. All she knew was that he'd left when David was a teenager, disappeared without warning. The resemblance, the pattern, it stung. She turned another page. September 1st. I think I understand now. Leaving wasn't running. It was the only way to stop pretending. I wanted you to hate me, because hate is cleaner than confusion. But I also wanted you to find this, someday. So you'd know I didn't stop loving you. I just stopped knowing how to live beside you. Emma closed her eyes. The cabin seemed to breathe with her, the air shifting as the wind pressed against the walls. Every word she read peeled back another layer of anger she'd built to protect herself. He wasn't the villain she'd made him. Maybe neither of them were. They were just two people who'd run out of ways to love each other without getting lost. She stood and walked toward the small desk in the corner. On it sat a stack of envelopes, each sealed and addressed to E.C., her initials. Some were dated years ago, others recent. Her hands trembled as she picked one up. The handwriting was David's, neater than before. She tore it open. Emma, if you found this place, it means I'm gone again. Maybe not forever, but gone in the way I always seem to be. chasing something I don't have words for. I'm sorry for the silence. I wanted to tell you everything in person, but I've learned I'm better at writing than speaking. You used to say the truth doesn't heal. It just changes what hurts. I think you were right. There's a key under the floorboard by the bed. Use it if you need to. I left something for you at the lake, the old dock where we used to sit. You'll understand when you see it. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, pried up one of the loose boards, and found a small tin box. Inside was a second key, rusty, and another note folded around it. I kept this for too long, your father's letter. He sent it after our wedding. I never showed you because I thought it would break something between us. But now, I think you deserve to know the kind of secrets we both carried. Emma froze. The paper felt thin, delicate, as she unfolded it. Her father's handwriting filled the page, dated the year she'd married David. Emma, if you're reading this, it means David has done what I once did, walked away. Don't blame him too harshly. Some men inherit silence like others inherit land. Take care of him if you can. He's more like me than he knows. Her knees went weak. The letter slipped from her hands. The connection, the strange, silent bond between the two men she'd loved most, felt almost cruel. She stood abruptly, the cabin spinning slightly around her. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was cool and sharp. She stepped off the porch and looked toward the path leading down to the lake. The mist was lifting, and somewhere in the distance, she thought she saw the faint outline of the dock. She tightened her grip on the tin box, heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. Maybe what waited there wasn't another answer, but another question, one only she could decide how to face. The path down to the lake was slick with mud, the kind that clung to her boots and made every step feel heavier. The trees leaned close, dripping water onto her shoulders, whispering in the wind like they knew what she'd just read. The air smelled of pine and rain and memory. When she finally reached the clearing, the lake stretched before her, still, gray, endless. The dock jutted out into the water, weathered and cracked, just as it had been years ago. The same place where David had first kissed her, where they'd once planned their future, where silence had often said more than words ever could. Emma walked slowly toward the end of the dock, her breath visible in the cooling air. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then her eyes caught a flash of metal wedged between the planks. Kneeling, she pulled out a small metal box, its surface tarnished and cold. Inside, wrapped in plastic to keep it dry, was another notebook, smaller than the first, with pages wrinkled from moisture. Her fingers hesitated before opening it. The first line hit her like a wave. If you've made it here, you've already forgiven me more than I deserve. She sat down on the damp wood, the water lapping softly below, and began to read. You once told me you hated endings. That every story should just fade, not stop. Maybe that's why I could never say goodbye. I wanted to fade from your life instead of shatter it. But fading doesn't work. It just leaves ghosts walking around in the living. Her eyes stung. I came back to this place more times than I can count. Not to hide from you, but to remember you the way we were before everything cracked. You deserved a man who could stay. I wanted to be that man. I just didn't know how to stop running from myself long enough to become him. Emma's fingers trembled. The words bled through the page, smeared by rain or tears, or both. If you find this, don't look for me. I've already made peace with the parts of me that broke us. But I hope you can find peace too. Burn this if you want. Or keep it. Either way, it's yours now. She closed the notebook, pressing it to her chest, and for a long time, she didn't move. The wind brushed her hair across her face, and the lake rippled gently, as if listening. For years, she'd imagined this moment differently. She thought she'd scream, curse his name, demand answers. Instead, all she felt was a quiet, aching understanding. He hadn't left because he stopped loving her. He'd left because he couldn't bear who he was becoming beside her. That was its own kind of tragedy, and, maybe, a strange kind of love. She looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to pierce through the fading clouds. The world felt both heavier and lighter all at once. Slowly, she stood and walked back toward the trees, clutching the notebook close. The drive home was silent. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't call anyone. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the rain were enough. When she reached her house, she placed the second journal on the kitchen table beside the first one. Together they looked like two halves of something unfinished, one written in guilt, the other in hope. She made tea, sat down, and opened a clean notebook from her own drawer. For a long moment, the page stayed empty. Then she began to write. October 15th. He didn't disappear. He just kept walking until he found a place where the silence stopped hurting. The words came easier than she expected. Maybe that was what he'd wanted all along, for her to tell the rest of the story. She wrote until the tea went cold, until her hand cramped, until she no longer felt like she was writing about him but for him. When she finally stopped, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the two journals beside hers. David's truth, her father's letter, her own voice, finally unbroken between them. She didn't know what would come next, if she'd ever see him again, if she even wanted to. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel lost, just alive. The next morning, Emma walked to the porch, the air crisp and bright. She carried the smaller notebook in her hands. Down the road, the mail truck was coming, a trail of dust behind it. She waited, heart steady, and when it stopped at her mailbox, she handed the notebook to the driver. "Can you send this to P.O. Box 217, Ashfield?" she asked. He nodded, taking the envelope carefully. She didn't know if the box still belonged to him, or if it ever had, but it didn't matter. The act of sending it was enough. The journal wasn't hers to keep anymore. It was the final echo of a story that needed to end. As the truck disappeared down the road, she stood there for a long while, watching until it was just a speck in the distance. Then she turned back toward the house, sunlight spilling across the porch, and smiled, not out of joy, but out of release. Some truths didn't destroy, some just set you free. And for Emma, that was enough. Weeks passed before Emma returned to the lake again. The season had shifted, autumn giving way to early winter. The air was sharper now, the edges of the water crusted with thin ice that cracked under the morning sun. She parked her old sedan by the same crooked tree and stood for a long time, staring at the rippling surface, wondering if some part of him had ever truly left this place. She thought about the journal she'd mailed weeks ago, the way her hands had trembled when she dropped it into the mailbox. She hadn't expected an answer. She wasn't even sure the address existed anymore, but part of her had hoped for something. A sign, a word, anything. That hope died quietly each morning the mailbox stood empty. But it wasn't sadness she felt now. It was something closer to acceptance, a calm she didn't recognize. She'd read the journal enough times to know every line by heart, yet somehow, it kept changing. The words didn't shift, but their meaning did, like sunlight through leaves. She began to understand the smallness of their tragedy, that two people could love each other deeply and still not survive each other. She'd spent years blaming him for leaving, and herself for not being enough to make him stay. But now, as she watched the mist rise from the lake, she wondered if love had ever been about staying at all. Maybe it was about letting the other person find peace, even if it meant letting go. When she turned back toward the car, she saw someone standing by it. A man, tall, with a worn jacket and a cautious stance, as if unsure whether to come closer. For a second, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But then he lifted his head, and she saw the eyes she'd memorized long ago. "David," she whispered, her breath catching. He didn't move right away. "Didn't think you'd still come here," he said, voice lower, rougher, as if every word had to fight its way out. "I shouldn't have," she said, though her feet carried her closer. The space between them closed slowly, like time reversing itself one hesitant second at a time. "I got your letter," he said. "You mailed it to an address that doesn't exist anymore. The post office forwarded it." She almost laughed. "Figures. I didn't even know it was real." "It used to be," he said, "before I left town." "You didn't really leave, did you?" Her voice softened. "You just disappeared into yourself." He nodded slightly, eyes on the ground. "That's fair." She studied him. There was gray in his beard now, lines where laughter used to live. He looked older, but not broken, just weathered, like the lake, still standing after the storms. "Why come back?" she asked. "Closure," he said after a long pause. "Or maybe because I couldn't stand the idea that you might still hate me." "I did," she admitted, "for a long time. Then I read your words. And somehow, I didn't anymore." He smiled faintly. "You always did forgive too easily." "No," she said. "I just finally understood." They stood there in silence, the cold wind carrying fragments of old memories around them. She wanted to reach for him, but she didn't. Some distances weren't meant to be crossed again. "What will you do now?" she asked. Keep moving, I guess. I'm not the man I was, Emma. And I don't expect you to still be the woman you were. I'm not, she said. I've learned to live with ghosts. Yours was just the loudest. He chuckled softly, then looked toward the water. It's strange. I thought if I ever saw you again, I'd want to explain everything. But I think the journal did it better. It did, she said. But you left something out. What's that? How it ended. He met her gaze, the faintest sadness flickering there. Maybe it doesn't have to end, he said quietly. Maybe it just changes shape. She nodded. Maybe. They stood together for a while, saying nothing. The sun dipped low, turning the water into a sheet of silver. She thought of all the things they could have been, and all the ways they'd already existed in each other's memories. When he finally stepped back, she didn't try to stop him. He gave a small wave, and she returned it, a gesture full of peace rather than loss. She watched until his figure faded into the trees, until the sound of his footsteps dissolved into the wind. Then she turned back to the lake. It no longer felt haunted. The ghosts were quieter now. That night, when she returned home, she lit a fire in the old stone fireplace. She took out her own notebook, the one she'd been writing since finding his journals. The pages were nearly full. On the last one, she wrote, "Sometimes, the people who vanish don't leave us empty. They leave us room to grow." She closed the notebook, feeling warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't look back. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that hurt. It was the kind that healed. The first snow of the season came 3 days later, soft and unhurried, coating everything in a quiet that seemed almost holy. Emma stood at her window, watching the world turn white, the branches bending gently under the weight. It was strange how life could feel so utterly different without anything actually changing. David's visit had been like a brief echo from another life, one she thought she'd buried, but now understood she'd only paused. He was gone again, but not in the way he had been before. This time there were no unanswered questions, no unfinished words lodged in her throat. Just a stillness, the kind that comes after a storm finally runs out of thunder. She made herself coffee, sat at the table where the 2 journals still rested, and for the first time didn't feel afraid to touch them. The paper had grown soft, fragile, like something sacred. She traced her fingers over David's handwriting, remembering the man he had been, and realizing that he'd finally become the one he'd always tried to be, even if it took losing everything. That afternoon, Emma drove into town. The snow was heavier now, and the roads shimmered under a layer of slush. Main Street looked the same diner, the same post office, the same bookstore with its dusty display window. Life had gone on quietly, as if her years of pain had existed in a different reality altogether. She stopped in front of the bookstore, the bell above the door chiming as she stepped inside. It smelled of paper and dust and comfort. An older woman behind the counter smiled. "Haven't seen you in a while, Emma." "Yeah," Emma said softly. "It's been a few years." "Still writing?" "Trying to," she said, glancing toward the back where a shelf of blank journals waited. She picked one up, black leather, smooth and unmarked. It felt heavy in her hands. The woman tilted her head. "New story." "Maybe," Emma said. "Or maybe just a continuation." She paid, tucked the notebook under her arm, and stepped back outside. The snow had stopped for now, and the air was sharp, every breath visible. She walked to the small park across from the diner and sat on a bench overlooking the frozen pond. For years, she'd avoided places like this, places that demanded stillness, that left her alone with her thoughts. But now, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like clarity. She took out the notebook and opened it to the first page. The pen hovered over the paper for a long moment before she began to write. There's something about snow that makes the world forgive itself. It covers the scars, softens the edges, and lets everything start over, even if only for a day. Her handwriting looked different now, steadier, calmer. She kept writing. "I used to think love was about staying. But maybe it's about letting go without bitterness, about loving someone enough to wish them peace, even when they find it far from you." The words flowed easily. She didn't plan what came next. She just followed the rhythm, the quiet voice that had waited years to speak again. By the time she closed the notebook, her fingers were numb, but her heart felt lighter than it had in a long, long time. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Emma drove back to the lake one last time. The world was pale gold, every surface reflecting light. The dock was half buried under snow, the water beneath frozen solid. She walked to the end and stood there, watching the sky. Then, from her coat pocket, she pulled out an envelope. Inside it, a single page torn from the new journal. On it, she'd written, "I forgive you, David. And I forgive myself, too." She weighed the envelope in her hand, then crouched down and slid it under the edge of the dock, where the ice met the wood. A small gesture, maybe meaningless to the world, but deeply symbolic to her. It wasn't about sending a message. It was about closing a circle. She stayed there until her breath came out in steady clouds and the cold bit into her skin. Then she smiled. Not the smile of someone healed completely, but of someone learning how to live again. When she turned to leave, she looked back one last time at the lake. "Goodbye," she whispered, though it sounded more like thank you. Months passed. The snow melted. Spring came slow but sure, dripping from the rooftops and thawing the ground. Emma kept writing, filling page after page with memories and reflections, not of loss, but of understanding. One afternoon, she received a letter, no return address, just her name written in familiar, uneven handwriting. Her heart stuttered as she opened it. Inside was a single note. "You were right. It didn't have to end. Thank you for helping me remember who I was." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. The ink was smudged, the paper worn, as if it had traveled far. She folded it carefully and placed it between the last pages of David's journal. For a moment, she closed her eyes and breathed, the scent of rain, of spring, of second chances. In some quiet, impossible way, the universe had given her an answer. Years later, when she was old and the lake had become her refuge rather than her reminder, Emma's niece found her journals stacked neatly in a wooden chest. On the cover of the last one was a single line written in faded ink, "For the ones we lose, and the ones we finally find within ourselves." The niece didn't understand the story behind those words, but she felt their weight. She opened the journal and began to read, unaware that in doing so, another cycle had begun, not of pain, but of understanding. Because stories like Emma's weren't about endings. They were about learning that even the ones who vanish leave behind more than absence. They leave behind echoes. And sometimes, those echoes are what teach us how to live again. The years rolled by quietly, in that soft, inevitable way time always does when no one is watching. Emma stayed in the same small town by the lake, though the house no longer felt like a place of waiting. She'd filled the rooms with books, light, and the occasional sound of friends dropping by unannounced. The journals, hers and David's, sat on a shelf beside the window, always visible, never opened anymore. They had become part of the scenery, like the lake outside, something you learn to live beside rather than within. It was a morning in early autumn when she felt the weight of those years most sharply. The air smelled of pine and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Emma brewed her coffee and sat at the same wooden table where it had all begun. The letter, the search, the rediscovery. The steam curled above the cup as she stared through the window at the mist hovering over the water. It looked like memory itself, beautiful, shifting, impossible to hold. She had written a lot since then. Dozens of notebooks lined her shelves, some filled with reflections, others with unfinished stories. Writing had become less about understanding David and more about understanding herself. What she'd done, what she'd forgiven, what she'd learned to carry without it crushing her. People in town had stopped talking about his disappearance long ago. To them, it was just one of those unsolved things that happens in quiet places. But to Emma, it had never been about solving it. It was about what remained. That afternoon, as the sun began to lower, she decided to take a walk down to the lake. The path was familiar, each step pressing into the damp earth, each sound amplified by the stillness. When she reached the dock, she paused. It was smaller now, warped slightly by time, but solid. The wind rippled across the surface of the water, breaking the reflection into 1,000 moving fragments. She knelt, brushing her fingers over the edge of the wood, and found something she hadn't expected, a fragment of paper caught between the planks, weathered and faded. She pulled it free carefully. The words were almost erased, but she could still make out the last line. Sometimes love isn't about coming back. It's about not forgetting who you were when you left. Her breath caught. It was David's handwriting. She didn't know when he'd written it, before he vanished or after, but somehow it had found its way back to her, the ink surviving the storms, the seasons, the silence. She sat there for a long time, holding that piece of paper, the edges damp against her skin. It wasn't sorrow she felt this time. It was gratitude, strange and unexplainable. Gratitude that he'd existed, that she'd loved him, and that their story, however fractured, had found its ending in its own quiet way. When she finally stood, the sun was dipping low, painting the lake in gold. She placed the paper back between the planks, letting it rest where the past belonged. Then she turned and walked home. That night, she lit a fire in the small stone hearth and opened a fresh notebook. The first blank page gleamed in the firelight, waiting. She picked up her pen, hesitated, then wrote. There are some stories that never truly end. They just change shape, becoming the air we breathe, the choices we make, the quiet moments when we finally forgive ourselves. Her handwriting looked different, stronger, more certain. She wrote until the fire dimmed, each word spilling easily, as though it had waited years for this release. When she stopped, she looked at the page and smiled. The story was no longer about David. It was about what remained when love no longer needed to be proven, when peace finally took its place. Weeks later, Emma hosted a small gathering at her house. Friends came with laughter, wine, and easy conversation. Someone played an old guitar. Someone else read a poem about finding beauty in the things that break us. Emma laughed more that night than she had in years. And when everyone left, she stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, the air cool and alive around her. The stars were clear above the lake, the same as they had been the night David disappeared. But now, instead of fear or loss, she felt a strange sense of belonging. The world had moved on, and so had she. She closed her eyes and whispered softly into the night. I hope you found what you were looking for. There was no answer, of course. Just the wind moving gently across the trees, as if carrying her words away to wherever he might be. In the years that followed, Emma's writings began to spread quietly through the world. Small presses printed her essays. Her reflections appeared in magazines under titles like Letters to the Ones Who Leave and The Geography of Forgiveness. People wrote to her, strangers, mostly, telling her that her words had helped them let go of someone they couldn't stop loving. She never replied to all of them, but she read each one. Every letter felt like another echo of what she and David had started, something that had once been pain, now turned to meaning. On her 63rd birthday, Emma walked to the lake once more. The water shimmered like glass, reflecting the sky. She brought with her a single envelope, sealed with wax. Inside was a short note. You were forgiven long before I even knew how. She slipped it into the water, watched it float for a moment before the current carried it away. Then she sat on the dock, her reflection trembling beside the clouds, and whispered, Goodbye, love. The word didn't hurt this time. It sounded like release.